Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's great to see you. Welcome to Sabbath Collective. We're a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. So tonight we are really going to get into it. We're going to ask ourselves the question, what does moving boundaries look like? And this is really a big issue today. It's really going to be very important and relative to pretty much all of us. So about 2 years ago, I guess it was, a good friend of mine had a gathering in her big co-op development after there was a wave of Muslim-phobic rants and ICE raids that left the Muslims in her community very afraid. So she did this big event, and it was to let them know that they were loved and they were accepted and this was their home. So I was telling somebody about the event, and what he said to me, so I guess you support the towelheads. And my initial reaction was, yes, because I'm not like you. But in truth, if a woman wants to wear a hijab out of her own convictions, fantastic. But if she is forced to wear one or she gets killed by a religious extremist, not so much. And obviously, all religious groups have those religious extremists. But the confrontation made me feel like I immediately wanted to jump into a sort of territory that I didn't necessarily align myself with the whole territory, if you're feeling me. Simply because I was not in his territory. So have you ever felt pushed to do this? And I just want to ask you to please write your comments tonight, because I think this is really going to elicit a lot of comments and hopefully a lot of discussion even afterwards, because this is a very real situation we find ourselves in today. So I want to take a look at a verse in Deuteronomy 19:14. And it says, you are not to move your neighbor's boundary marker from the place where people put it long ago. So look, it says here, you are not to move your neighbor's boundary marker from the place where people put it long ago. And so again, this is your directive. And the concept for this not moving your neighbor's boundary marker is actually seen several times in Scripture. These boundaries are markers. And they usually are stones, similar to this. This is an ancient boundary marker stone. And they mark a person's property that has, for the most part, been in existence for a long while, which is why it references the ancestors having marked it. And it's also the presumption that the Lord is the one who marked it originally. So we're not to move our neighbor's boundaries. So, hey, Carolina, great to see you, honey. Good to have you with us. So the word for move is the Hebrew word sug, and it means, listen to this, when we talk about moving boundaries, it means to turn back, to backslide, to turn oneself away, or to be driven back. So culturally, this moving of a land boundary was understood to be done most commonly by a neighbor that would go in at night and secretly move the stone of your property, of his neighbor's property, in order to gain and extend his own property. So that was the most common way that it really happened there, is that a neighbor came in and moved it. It could also be moved by the property owner himself because in some way he was swindled or tricked. But moving boundary markers is some serious stuff. Deuteronomy 27:17 says, a curse on anyone who moves his neighbor's boundary marker. A curse on anyone who moves his neighbor's boundary marker. So that is a really serious thing. I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to be cursed. So all the people, the text goes on, are to say amen. So in Deuteronomy 27:17, it says, a curse on anyone who moves his neighbor's boundary markers, and all the people are to say amen. We agree with it. As the JPS Torah commentary points out from this verse, the same concept is found in Proverbs, it's found in ancient Near Eastern law, it's found in wisdom literature, and even Plato's laws. Moving boundaries is a big thing. So, I don't know if you all think like this or if it's just me, I don't know. But when we think moving boundaries and we think it's a big thing, moving boundaries is part of our cultural heritage in the United States. Everything from natives to today, eminent domain. Moving boundaries is actually a very accepted practice in this culture. And I'm going to get into how that looks in a little bit in other kinds of territory. Hey, Barika, great to see you, honey. Good to have you with us. So let's take a look at this ancient pictograph. And again, before there was ancient Hebrew letters, there were ancient pictographs. And so these pictographs were pictures of things. And again, the Hebrew scriptures is very tactile. We see it, we get images. So the word boundary is the word gabul, and it means to set a boundary or territory. The root verb is gabal, and it means the ends or edges of a territory. So let's look at the letters, these ancient pictographs that spell the word gabal, because we can kind of get an insight. The first one is the word foot. It's the letter gimel, and it means a foot. And it has the concept of walking. And it's also often connected to water, like you're leading animals to water. Gimel. The second letter is the letter bet, and that's the letter that means a tent or a house. It means a family or an identity. Hey, Andrew, great to see you. Glad you joined us. So bet is the tent, the house, or a family or identity. And the last letter is the letter lamed, which is the picture of a shepherd's staff. And it means to direct or to lead. So let's put these three letters meanings in the context of what a boundary is. To live within a boundary is to have your life, your walk, led by the shepherd and be fully connected to your identity. Okay, so that it's your roots, so to speak, which is what your family means. In ancient Jewish literature, the tangible physical concept of marking property also was applied to misappropriations in attributing someone else's writing to oneself. So in other words, one rabbi writes something and I say, I wrote it. This is moving the boundaries. And eventually in Jewish law, it became connected to copyright infringement and even also unfair competition, which meant, in a practical way, if I was a fisherman in a little village and I had a little pond and some big guy from a neighboring community comes over and blocks up my pond and begins to fish with his big nets, that would be moving the territory, moving the boundaries, which is unfair competition. And then it went from moving landmarks, physical landmarks, which it will mean, to violating boundaries, which is where we're going to be tonight. Violating boundaries or moving someone's boundaries. The Kiel and the Delitzsch Bible commentary dealing with this particular text in Deuteronomy quotes F.W. Schultz's remarks concerning this text. And it says, property by which life is supported, property by which life is supported participates in the sacredness of life itself. Okay, now let's just pause in that for a second because this is really, really deep. And F.W. Schultz is specifically talking about the text in Deuteronomy not to move a neighbor's property boundaries. And how he defines this, property by which life is supported. Because remember, the meaning expanded out. It has more meaning than just physical land. Property by which life is supported participates in the sacredness of life itself. So what does that mean? That means the place that we stand in, that we're led to, that our values are rooted in, is the sacredness of life itself. It supports our life. And the boundaries marked and protected the sacredness of life. Are you with me? Because this is the foundation of where we're going from here. Ryan says it reminds me a lot of Paul talking about circumcision in Romans or discussing the laws surrounding the eating of non-kosher food. Exactly. Paul does a lot of boundary work in his writing. Hey, Sissy, great to see you. So in the Torah, many of the laws are given to Jews with the express purpose of protecting their convictions. There's a lot of laws in the Tanakh that are written for the Jews living in Israel. And the reason for that is living next to other countries and having other people live in their country, which, by the way, they welcomed people coming into their country. They just needed to obey the laws, but they were welcomed into their country. But there is a danger of losing one's values when you're so immersed in around other people's values. So these fences, these boundaries were given to them by Adonai in scriptures to make sure their life, their identities were not lost. Then the rabbinic scholars even added more fences, to be sure. So all of us have boundaries around us as well. Those protective fences by which life and identity are supported. And I really want to look tonight at those life identity boundaries as protecting your values and your convictions, who you are, and subsequently what it means to move those boundaries. So this concept of not allowing markers to be changed is an important one. Like the story I shared in the very beginning of tonight. That man made me feel like I was to move my boundaries because, hey, I'm definitely not with you. And if you're forcing me to take a side, I'm going to take the side over here. But again, he's pushing me to move my own boundaries. We need to protect the sacred values that we hold. You should never just allow someone to move you into new boundaries or for you to just sort of slip into it. So let's look tonight at the cultural push to change our boundaries. And I'm just going to talk about 3 ways that it can happen, even though there's actually a lot more. Okay, unfortunately, there's all kinds of things that are pushing us to change our boundaries today. The first one that we see is submission. And again, if you're feeling this, if you're seeing this in your own life, hey, Eddie's son, great to see you. Good to have you with us. If you're feeling any kind of practical application, throw it out in the comments so we can all kind of relate to it because all of us are going through this in a bazillion different ways. So the first way that we see with people trying to change our boundaries, our territory markers, our belief systems, our values, is submission. Submission, behave like they tell you to behave. Be nicer. Dress different. Be quieter. It's all you ever talk about. Let me see how many of you feel that people are pushing you to behave like how they want you to behave, and that you feel like you are being pushed into changing your boundaries and your convictions. People of color especially feel this. I read one person's post recently, and she posted something on her Facebook page about a political situation, and one of her friends commented back. I almost never read other people's comments, and this is why. She commented back, "Send me your proof." So this young lady sent her proof. The other person comments back to my friend, "I don't see it that way. Send me more proof." She sent her more proof. 3 times she sent her proof, and the lady was like, "Well, I just don't believe it." So she went from "send me the proof" to "well, I'm seeing the proof, but now I just don't believe it." And then my friend said, "Well, I just can't." And the woman responded back, "I thought you people were supposed to be tolerant." What is that? It's submission. Behave this way so you will be accepted and heard. It pushes you, if you allow it, to change your boundaries of conviction. And if my friend felt like she had 3 different times where she shared true facts with her, and she wouldn't hear it. She recognized her as an energy vampire, and she wanted to do the dip. And someone saying, behave, act like how you should, that forces us to change our boundaries. And how many of us have felt that? Let me see your thumbs up, which I'm seeing some already. The second thing we see is a word called syncretism. And what this means is it's a combination of different ideologies. And this is really sort of insidious. And it's what we feel and see a lot these days. It's referred to sometimes as a third option, which, sometimes third options can be good, right? But most of the times, it creates a weak, ineffective, and confusing alternative. Politically and religiously, we see this syncretism. It's really ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And this is actually the essence of the Torah's Kilayim laws, which is a series of prohibitions against the intermixing of certain species. By the way, it has nothing to do with races, like some races try to make it. It has to do with certain species to keep this truth at the forefront of the Jewish people's minds. We read things like, you shall not sow your vineyard with diverse seeds, or you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. And the reason for that is there is a danger in the case of cross-wired thinking processes of the creation of a hybrid or a third species kind of thing, which is really not healthy at all, this third species. So let me give you an example of this. Years ago, I was in Trinidad, years and years ago, I was in Trinidad, and I met some people. I was at a church, and I met some people at this church that told me the story of when European white missionaries came to their country, and the very first, with the gospel, and the very first thing they did was tell them that their steel drums needed to be out and the organs needed to be in. This is what they did. And so somehow the drums became sinful, and it was God or the drums. So the people felt like, well, if that's my choice, I'm gonna pick God. Well, obviously, as you can imagine, as this went on for a bit longer, the young people that were longing to connect to their heritage began to leave the church. So years after the white missionaries did this, the older Trinidadians thought, well, we need to do something because the young people are leaving and they're reconnecting to the steel drums and the instruments that are culturally ours. So let's try to do a new thing. And so then they did this thing, this sort of hybrid thing in their churches, where they took the hymns that they sang with the organs that they played, and they tried to add a steel drum to it. You all have seen that, right? And then they did all kinds of spiritual and mental gymnastics, which had to sort of be done to maintain that. It's a hybrid. And it's actually pretty disgusting to look at, isn't it? You see, most of the time, combining ideologies really doesn't work. In this week's Torah's reading, actually, this next week, we'll see this option that Abraham faced when his nephew Lot got captured. And Abraham had to go on with this very small army. He only had a little over 300 people to rescue him. And the king of Sodom offered Abram a huge reward and said, give the people to me and take all the goods for yourself. Have you heard the saying before, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Right? This is syncretism. This blending together would have made Abraham very wealthy. But he knew that the king of Sodom was both wise and wicked. And he did not want to owe anything to him or make a relationship with him. So he refused the proposal, and he told him no in Genesis 14:22. For fear you would say, I am the one who made Abraham rich, instead of Yahweh. You see, Abraham knew homogenizing isn't always the best way. And so we have this sense of submission, people trying to force us into submission and push our boundaries of our value system. And then we also have syncretism, which is this sense of work with other people in order to get things done, but then there's this homogenization and a hybrid occurs, which has no effectiveness whatsoever. And by the way, if you've ever felt this, definitely let me know. Or if you want to share how you felt that, put it in the comments section. And the third part is compromise. So we have submission, we have syncretism, and we have the last one, compromise. And compromise is what I would call an ideological flexibility. It's really a loss of purity in the original conviction. So normally, as you know, I talk about concepts, biblical concepts, and then you all kind of wrestle through in a practical way how to live that out. And I don't necessarily talk about specific politicians per se, but tonight I want to use a specific political issue that happened because it perfectly illustrates this last one of compromise and ideological flexibility and what happens here and how that allows us to move our boundaries in an unhealthy way. The Kavanaugh hearings. Pro-life people want Roe v. Wade overturned. That's a conviction that they have. And I understand that. And I also understand that when people watch these testimonies, they saw two completely different perspectives. In fact, when I read people's comments about them or assessment, I almost couldn't even believe that two people were watching the same thing. And so as my heart was actually breaking for women who are not being heard, and keep in mind I'm a counselor, and I have worked with hundreds of victims of sexual abuse. I just kept asking, why not just pick a new candidate? If this is important to you, if you have a particular agenda with this new Supreme Court nominee, why not just pick a new candidate? And then there was something new that was entered into this whole hearing situation where this unbiased candidate, Kavanaugh, made a very biased, angry statement, kind of disqualifying himself from being an impartial judge, right? And I asked again, why not just pick a new candidate? I understand you have a conviction about this one thing, but there are other things going on here that are very important as well. Here's the strange thing about compromise as an ideological flexibility. You get swept up in a tidal wave of passion and you lose your main focus. And most of all, you lose all perspective. And people who, like last Friday, when we talked about the leaven of the Pharisees, we talked about the Pharisees actually thought they were doing the right thing for God. But they made choices to compromise other right things to get their one thing that they felt like was important. And Yeshua called that exact thing the leaven of the Pharisees, which is pretty serious. Ryan saying blinded by our own convictions. Brika says this is exactly what I was thinking, as if there weren't 1,000 other qualified people. Exactly. Exactly, and that's logic and common sense, right? But when you get sucked into this, and it's this kind of real loss, this ideological flexibility and this compromise, you lose your main focus, just like the Pharisees did. If you missed last week, definitely listen. Again, Yeshua calls it the leaven of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, which is leaven. And they don't even realize its contradiction. So let's look at the contradiction here. Pro-life, okay, when we talk about pro-life means for all life. Not just life in the womb, but after it is born. And the alliances that some have made to work towards this agenda are clearly compromise. Pro-life means keeping all lives safe, whether it's in our schools or public places, or it's the freedom for people of color to not get killed in the streets or their own beds. For all life means children shouldn't be kept in cages and separated from their parents. For all life means that anything that threatens life, the life of another, should be stopped, should be removed, or should be fixed. For all life means we should care about this planet and the animals and the plants. For life means even the mother carrying the unborn child needs support, like health care. And mocking and threatening a woman who is doing what she believes is the right thing to do, facing death threats, cameras, cross-examination, and to be called a liar, is not for all life. So is pro-life still there? Or is it anti-abortion by any means necessary, making political and even religious alliances where there's the losing of some life in the process, but that's okay because it's collateral damage. Now let's do the other side of the coin. The people that say they are for equality, for respecting humanity and honoring their decisions and opinions and right to choose. Some of the worst judgmentalism I've ever seen or heard is coming out of the people that say they love and care about people. But just like that, they can turn murderous almost towards people that have different opinions. I was talking to someone at a farmer's market recently about our red tide problem and about glyphosates and all of it. And we were talking about Big Bad Farm and all that. And we were really on the same page, both of us really well read. And she said to me, well, as vegans. And then she said it again, well, as vegans. And here I felt the boundary push, right? And I had to say back the second time, I'm actually not a vegan. I eat organic, humanely slaughtered beef. And I know I even had a hard time saying that to her, but it's what I eat. And she looked at me and she said, well, I don't even know why you're here. You're not one of us. I don't know why you come to this farmer's market. I don't know why you support our causes. You're a murderer. See, there's such anger, right? And I get it. I know why. But we want to put people in camps very quickly. It's our actual physiological brain design to identify our enemy quickly in order to keep ourselves safe. But people pushing others to move their boundaries, not good. Love is replaced by frustration and anger, and then ultimately hate. And hate has no place in your territory. And neither does unholy alliances under the guise of getting something done that you think is important. Our prime example of staying in our territory and not allowing our boundaries to be moved really is Yeshua. He would not be moved. Even when the temptation by Satan came to offer him to be what people wanted him to be, he would not be moved. Even when people wanted to get him to hate or prove who he was, he would not be moved. People pushed and pulled him to come away from his boundaries. He did not. He did not acquiesce to submission, to being what they wanted him to be, what they said he should act like, to syncretism, which is this sort of hybrid of something, or to compromise, which is this ideological gray area. He spoke truth, sometimes very strongly, but in love. And he actually told us to pray for our enemies. So how do we practically work together with those who are different? How to be flexible without losing your ideology? Let me see your thoughts here. And while you're writing, I'm going to give you an example of one of the things that I do. I'm involved with a lot of people that are connected to Latin Constantinian traditions. I'm involved with them online. I write letters with them. I do all kinds of things. It's very a politically active group. And most of them will say they only read what Yeshua said in the New Testament, and that everything else is not for us. And they do religious traditions that I am not in alignment with at all. In fact, it came directly from Constantine, okay? And pretty much nothing as far as how I relate to understanding scripture from a Hebraic perspective is how they look at it. However, they love the Lord. They believe they're following him, and they are doing good work. They are fighting the good fight, and they are not causing me to change my boundaries at all. So even though I'm not in alignment with them religiously speaking, I do a lot of work with them because we have the same values. And so I'm not compromising, and neither are they. Ryan's saying, waving towel. Hey, hi Lynette, nice to see you. Lynette's saying preach. Thank you, Rye. Hey Caroline, yes, good, glad to see you. And so this is an example of how we can work with people that are not exactly like us, but we don't need to compromise our boundaries, which is very, very important. I saw this in another example after the Parkland school shooting, which was in the state where I live in Florida. We had a March for Our Lives, as people did all over the country. And I went on that march, which is in Tampa, and I met both people who owned guns. I live in Florida, okay? I'm talking multiple guns they owned, right? They owned guns. A lot of them had permits to carry guns, right? And they loved their guns, but they wanted gun law reform. They do not believe it's okay for a person to just buy a gun at a gun show. They want mental health checks. They want criminal background checks. They want gun law reforms. So they marched in this march. And then there was also people who feel adamantly so that no one in the United States should have guns, not even the police. This is the two extremes, right? Not even the police. And they were for no guns at all. And yet these two groups marched together for gun law reform. Now, the thing is, neither one of them are interested in changing their boundaries, and they don't need to. They can both work together for reform. Now, one group may say, okay, that's good enough for me, and one group may say, that's not good enough for me, and so then they're going to keep on going. But they don't become enmeshed and make the hybrid, as I was saying before. They both are true to what they're feeling without compromise, which is important. So we have our highest priorities. And then if we make compromises in things, we've calculated what those compromises are without changing our value system. It does not have to move our boundaries. Does that make sense? And then hear me say this, because this is another thing that I really see people plummeting in right now. In my choices, my political choices, let's say, I must realize my choice is not the only right choice. And when I vote, my candidate is not some sort of God prophetically chosen candidate and the savior of my state or country. That's religious mania, okay? I'm sorry. It is not and can never be that no matter what my candidate, he or she does or says, I'm always in, because God has them. I am clear and I am open about what I see and what I agree and what I disagree with. Anything else is making a political leader an idol. And trying to spiritualize our decisions by saying God is on our candidate's side Anne Lamott, quoting her priest friend, says this best: "You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do." That is a keeper. I'll say it one more time. You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. And we see this today so much it makes my head explode. Our political climate is moving more and more towards a Greek one every day. It's either or. Either you're in this camp or you're in this other camp. And sometimes we feel forced to align ourselves with things we may not agree with. Do not. What does moving boundaries look like? Moving boundaries looks like losing your sense of being led and therefore losing your way and your very identity. Make and keep your boundaries with integrity. Do not allow your boundaries to be moved without intention. I want you to see this. I'm going to say it one more time. Make and keep your boundaries with integrity. Do not allow your boundaries to be moved without intention. In other words, if you are going to move your own boundaries, it's with intention. It's not that you're being forced into it, and it's not that you're slipping into it. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shavuos candles. I want you to encourage you to keep commenting here, because I really think some of you have some great wisdom in how you live your lives in a way where you don't allow your boundaries to be compromised, or maybe you have and you see it and you want to pull it back. Traditionally, the mothers light the candles in the home, which connects us to the Sabbath light of peace, of joy, and of unity. And then she typically encircles the candles with her hands. This is a tradition 3 times, which is a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. And then she prays as she covers her eyes from the flame as a symbol of ending all work. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has sent us to be a light to the world. The Lord is our light and our salvation. May his light be felt in this space as the enlightenment of truth and the radiance of joy. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.